Hi, and welcome to Behind the Numbers. This is the podcast that explores the people and the insights behind business success. I'm Dave Bookbinder, and I'm known as a business valuation expert and best-selling author. Numbers tell a story, but they don't tell the whole story, gang. Let's go behind the numbers. So money is emotional. Every financial decision we make is shaped by experiences, beliefs, fears, and behaviors that frankly may have nothing to do with spreadsheets or market performance. In today's episode of Behind the Numbers, we're going to explore the psychology around money. In other words, why people think about money the way they do, how emotions impact financial decisions, and what advisors and business owners often miss when they focus only on the numbers. Joining me today is my friend Kate Duffy. She's a senior vice president and wealth advisor at Bryn Mawr Trust, where she helps her clients navigate complex financial transactions. She also holds the specialized Certified Financial Behavior Specialist designation, and she's also the co-host of the Planning Perspectives podcast, where she also digs into the human side of wealth management. Kate, finally, welcome to the show.
Dave, thank you so much for having me. It has been sort of quite the obstacle to get on the show, but here we are. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and when she says obstacles, she's referring to technical glitches that we finally were able to overcome. So all good. I'm thrilled that you're here. So let's get this party started, shall we?
Do it.
All right. Well, you've spent your career looking at the human element that standard financial plans really tend to ignore. You often say that money carries a duality. It's a technical tool, but also a metaphorical currency for things like power, control, safety, self-worth. So when you sit down with a client who is completely stalling on a flawless, logically perfect financial plan, how do you diagnose which emotional currency is actually driving that behavior roadblock?
So, the first thing you have to do is open your ears. You have to listen and you have to get curious. Because what we find is that when you can tie a behavior back to its origin story, it makes a lot of sense. I will give you a very easy, I think, relatable example. So, for someone who has grown up in the aftermath of the Great Depression, who was poor and knew what it felt like to lose everything, they might have a behavior of oversaving, if you can imagine. Because that person can feel in their body what it was like to be poor, it is so important to save everything. And the example that I use often is my dad. So he grew up in the aftermath of the Great Depression, and he does not need to, but he saves tinfoil. And so when we go back and I ask him about that, he says to me, he was like, we grew up in completely different economic times, different socioeconomic environments. And he's like, I know what that feels like, and I don't ever want to feel that again. So the behavior of saving tinfoil when you don't financially have to makes a lot of sense. So I have those conversations with clients. When clients come to a roadblock, I just start to get curious and start to ask questions. And when you ask a question and you're curious, people will tend to open up. And I will tell you, Dave, when I tell people I am a financial behavioral specialist, the floodgates open. People want to talk about these things. They want to understand why they keep coming up with the same challenges. And so that's how I start. I start asking questions and we kind of take a trip down memory lane.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on this show, because you're not like the others. You bring this unique perspective, and it is fascinating. And when you talk about the memories of the Great Depression, I had older relatives that also went through that. And yeah, I saw exactly what you were talking about. And I remember way back in the day, relatives, I'm embarrassed to say, taking sweet and low from delis because that's what they felt like they needed to do. So with that as sort of the backdrop, when you think about these childhood scripts that you just alluded to, what other behaviors then manifest later in life in this sort of financial dysfunction?
So there's a lot of different behaviors. Like if we sit with, like sometimes what I'll do is I'll ask people to think about their earliest emotional money memory, not the numbers, the emotions of the memory. And if you sit with that for 30 seconds, and then you start to sort of cull through some of the experiences in your life, what you will recognize is those emotions scale as decades pass. So we have people that are facing the same things, people who are living spending a lot of their money over and over again. Like they aren't able to put a particular plan in place to continue to save for themselves. Because again, we come back to this metaphorical currency of what does money mean? Sometimes spending feels really good. And so it helps you cope with difficult emotions. If we think about money being, it could be part of our identity.
Yeah.
Right. So we make decisions based on who we think we are in this moment or the identity that we are cultivating for right now. I think a lot about entrepreneurs when I think about this question, because when we're working with business owners and people who've developed or created a business, when you create something, you are tied to it. There is ownership. There is identity. So when we see business owners sort of approaching exit or scaling a business, we see there's difficulty in letting go. So it's early on, how did I gain control through money? What did it mean for my identity and the person that I created for myself? And then that shows up decades later.
Yeah. And great point. And I want to talk about that with business owners and identity, because yes, the business is their thing. It's their purpose. It's their mission. It's their child. And they'll spend decades looking at their company, in my world, as the enterprise value, right? What's the business worth? But when they sell it, that asset suddenly become a pile of cash, hopefully a lot of cash. So
Mm-hmm.
beyond the tax and estate planning, I want you to talk about the psychological toll of that transition, specifically around how do you help the entrepreneur navigate that loss of the identity you refer
Yeah.
to and the purpose when they're no longer captaining that ship.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I've observed often is that, let's say, the financial independence that is created through a business exit does not necessarily mean the psychological readiness of stepping in to that next phase, because that's often like financial complexity scales very predictably. Human complexity does not. We have industries focused on the financial complexity. We have M&A attorneys and advisors, and we have estate planners, and we have the entire wealth management industry that is here and structured, ready to help people sort through the financial decisions of what it looks like for an exit. But you are letting go of something you created. Like, what is the next chapter? What is your next, if you will, in life? Because this does not just affect the individual, it also affects their family. Have you ever worked with a business advisor where their partner is like, they're around all the time now? So there is this next phase of like, when you are stepping from one identity into another, how do we do that in advance versus in crisis? Because when you are doing that in crisis and you are sort of ready for the financial transaction, but you are not ready psychological for what comes next, we often see people hanging on to the business and the transition is more difficult. We see entrepreneurs going back to work. So it's starting to have those conversations early on. You want to think about 2 to 5 years out what it looks like to chart the path to exit. This conversation has to be a part of that plan, because that is what helps support a successful exit. I'd be interested to hear some of the stories that you've seen with clients as well, Dave, because I'm sure you run into this all the time.
Yeah, it is an identity crisis. And I hear a lot, my spouse doesn't want me hanging around all the time, so I don't know what I do. So I'll just have to hang out in the business. And in doing so, they may miss out on a great opportunity to sell when the market is right, when the business is humming along. And they may not get a better situation to actually pull the trigger on an exit because they just don't know what they're going to do next.
Right. And you know what else gets caught up in that valuation? Because I think you say it in your toolbook, in your book, the toolbook for advisors, for clients and advisors, is that one of the challenges of valuation is sort of not getting it wrong, but one of the mistakes is overvaluing it, because entrepreneurs oftentimes are sort of factoring in all of the sacrifice that they have made, the missed birthdays, and the buyer doesn't care. Like that doesn't show up on the balance sheet. And so you have these things that challenge sometimes the exit from the valuation perspective, missing the right market environment to be able to sell, that becomes a part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that we are having this conversation because I know so many folks are going to benefit from unpacking the emotional and psychological impacts on everything that we're discussing here. So you sort of alluded to a quote on your Planning Perspectives podcast, and it stuck with me. And your actual quote, I think, was something like, "You can plan in advance or you can plan in crisis." So business owners are brilliant at strategic planning for their companies, but many of them actually delay their exit, right? Because their succession plan until a crisis really forces their hand, sometimes for reasons that we've just discussed. Talk a little bit more about how people are psychologically wired to avoid planning for the inevitable, and how do you break through that? We'll call it a defense mechanism.
Yeah. So, one of the things we could easily talk about how different we are today versus who we were 5 or 10 years ago. It's so much harder to understand or to grasp who we might be in the future versus who we are today. We essentially think our future selves are so similar to our present selves, which isn't the case if we even think about our past selves. So what ends up happening is people stay stuck in this present. You have to be able to toggle on and off these mindsets. People stay in the present, and if things are good or they're not bad, it's like, why do I have to do anything? Status quo does not require a ton of mental energy and effort. Routine is very easy. So we have to know when or to turn these things on and off, because while status quo is great, we have to know that down the road, when a business owner exits, there are going to be other challenges that come up. And how do we prepare for those? Because a lot of times I hear, well, it's not an issue now. I was talking to a business owner that is thinking about next gen, and everybody is in a very copacetic state right now. But the ownership of the business that is going to different children is going to cause a challenge in the family. They know it. They don't want to touch it. So you can plan in advance now, and you can start to say, how do I even begin to have these conversations? Or you can wait until it's a crisis, and then you're forced, and you've got people emotionally overwhelmed at that point. What happens is when we are emotionally overwhelmed, we become rationally challenged. And when we become rationally challenged, some of these conversations just shut down.
Yeah.
They just shut down. We get defensive. We have our own agenda. We have what we want. We have what we think we're entitled to. And it stalls the conversation. One of the things, like inheritance, whether it be a business or wealth or whatever it is, that is an event in and of itself. But stewardship of these things is developed over time. It doesn't happen in one event. And so the planning in advance part is partially starting to open the door to these conversations and starting to plan early, because preparation for the next gen must precede scale. Whether it's the ownership of the business or its wealth, you have to prepare the next generation.
Yeah, 100%. And we see that a lot in my day-to-day on the valuation side, where we're engaged to do estate planning valuations, or in situations where someone's passed along and now we're valuing the estate. And yeah, that conversation hasn't happened. So right now, we're supposed to be in the middle of this silver tsunami, right? The largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history, so the pundits say. But when you talk about this communication element of wealth transfer, how do you coach your clients so that they're having these conversations and don't wind up destroying the family relationships?
Yeah. So it takes time. I would say the first thing is someone has to be open to it. Money has been a taboo topic. It is not regular dinner conversation. People are very private about it. And definitely if you think of different generations and how they operated with money and how they talked about it, that comes into play. So the first thing is to be curious. I'd mentioned how much we might change individually over a period of time, and we can recognize it in ourselves. But when we are so familiar with people, whether it be business partners, our family, our kids, our parents, we think we know them so well, and we stop being curious. We don't afford them the amount of change over time that we will afford ourselves in sort of our growth and development. So we need to stop and recognize that all of the people around us have grown in significant ways. So the first step, I say, especially if you're in like a family business, is get curious. I'll give you this little anecdote. This happened a few years ago. So I am a middle child. I have an older sister and a younger brother. And we were at my parents' house for dinner, and for some reason our families couldn't come with us. So it was my nuclear 5 family. We go to sit down at the dinner table, and we all took the same seats that we did when we were kids. And I will tell you, the maturity level dropped just a little bit between me and my siblings. There are these roles that we come to play in our lives, whether it's someone's daughter, it's someone's sister, someone's wife, someone's mother. And in these family dynamics, we show up in that role. Because what happens if we step outside of that role, if I were to take the head seat of the table at that family dinner, everyone would have been like, what are you doing? I'm stepping outside of my role. We all would have laughed about it, but it would have sparked a conversation because people's antenna go up. So what I tell clients is just start to get curious. Start to think about your partner or your child in a different way. Can you do that? Number one, think of all the things you've seen your parent or your child accomplish. And start to think about them as a business partner, and sometimes people are doing that, but they're still holding that role as son or daughter or whatever it might be. So it's get curious. And then how do we have the conversation? I've been approached, how do I talk to my kids about the wealth that we've created? I've been approached by kids. I know I'm getting an inheritance. How do I ask my parents, like, what I'm going to get? And we go back to this value conversation because that's not easily, people want to transfer their money, they want to transfer their values, but they don't want to talk about the value system. Because when you say money, people don't automatically think about values, but where we spend our money and our time very clearly shows what our values are. So it's how do we craft for ourselves what our values are that we want to pass down? So you have to do some introspection as well. Like this stuff doesn't always come easily. If we're not used to doing it all the time, it's a training and a coaching that we have to do. And so I do that with clients. We'll sit and sort of talk back and forth about if they want to have the conversation with the next gen to say, this is the value system that I want to transfer. We start to talk about values. We help the client get very clear on what their values are, knowing their different children. How are people going to take it? Like, do you need to sort of massage one message for one child versus another? So that's how we do a lot of the coaching. It's a lot of talking and helping the client come to the next best decision for themselves. Because in this relationship, there are two experts. I have expertise and education and experience in my field, but I will never be you. You are the expert in you. And so we need to draw that out and sort of marry those two things.
Yeah, really good stuff there because you're right about the roles that people show up with when you're sitting around that dinner table. And underneath all of that is the mindset or the head trash that they've accumulated over the years, where maybe you've got parents that grew up scratching and saving in a scarcity mindset, and the kids grew up as a result in abundance. And now you've got to bridge that gap between the generations.
Right. Because what I've observed also is, especially in first generation entrepreneurs that are oftentimes coming from nothing and they are overcoming incredible obstacles. They don't want their children to necessarily face the same obstacles that they have. But in those obstacles, they have developed values and skills and everything that has allowed them to overcome the challenge that the socioeconomic status that they grew up in. So there's so much value in that, but it's how do we transfer on that value system when we don't want our kids to have those experiences?
Yeah. I want to ask you, staying with the behavioral specialist focus, if you will, is there a big blind spot, a singular blind spot that you see from wealthy families or entrepreneurs?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that the understanding, I would say the values is the biggest blind spot. There was a family that was a multi-generational wealth family that did a phenomenal job in getting the younger generations involved very early from the financial perspective, understanding what money was. How did the family generate the money? How do we think about investing? How do we set ourselves up for the future from a financial perspective? And I used to think this is the way to do it, because we don't have any fundamental education around money in our school systems, or at least we didn't when I was growing up. And so who are we learning from? Our parents, our grandparents, our friends' parents, our schools, our communities, our churches, all of those things. And so I was like, this is a really thoughtful way to bring the youngest generations into the family. And everybody was engaged and they knew how to operate from a financial portfolio perspective, the questions to ask, the planning. The value piece of it and what money means was not discussed along the way. And so as this young generation grew into college age and young adults, you saw a lot of floundering. The financial preparation only went so far. And I don't want to get into the details of what was unfolding, but there were trusts that were dissolved. Like the wealth just evaporated for some, because you were dealing with these struggles of young people in early adulthood not having an understanding of the family value system or a purpose. Because when everything is sort of financially given to you, the question becomes, okay, now what is my purpose? What am I supposed to do? I don't even have to go out and find how to figure out how to live. And so I think a lot of times it is the value conversation that is the biggest blind spot, but also understanding that different generations, that what affects that value system. And different generations, I mean, you think about the silent generation, the boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials, the Gen Z, like you've got wildly different socio or economic environments that these generations grew up in. And that's part of what shapes a value system. It's not just the family dynamics and what you grew up in as a child. It's all of the other experiences that we have as well.
Kate, I wonder, when you're working with the younger folks in your client base, is there any kind of correlation between if the parents are savers, the kids are savers, or is it the opposite? If the parents are savers, the kids are spenders, or no correlation at all?
So it can go all different ways. And you might have heard this. I've certainly heard this. I've observed it. I've experienced it. My parent was this way, and I never want to be that way. I do not want to feel that way. Like, we never enjoyed anything growing up because my parents were saving so much money. They just never enjoyed it. And so now I want to make sure that I'm enjoying my life. Like, if we think about an experience of like a young teenager whose parents ended up in bankruptcy when she was in early high school. All of a sudden, financial insecurity was elusive. So it was like, you can have it one day and you cannot have it the next day. And so how does that person develop? The person can develop in a multitude of ways. It depends on what the belief system is about money. They can either agree with that it is elusive, and start spending all of the time, whatever. I could have, no money tomorrow, so I might as well spend what I have. Or that could feel very insecure for someone, that they want to ensure that they are financially set up, which could cause them to oversave. And they're not spending because they never want to be in that position again. The thing about the belief system that we have about money is, studies show that it is developed very early on in life, before we're 10 years old. And if you think about that, 10-year-old children and younger are not rational. Our rational brains don't come on until about 30 years old. And so when you're a child and you are dealing with a challenging situation, what we know is that children straddle reality. The reality that we are in right now, we're sitting here doing this podcast, but there's also a very imaginative and creative world that kids live in. And we know that when they have fights with their stuffies, or my 5-year-old niece, she's a tea party with her invisible friends that are there. To her, they're there. To someone else, they're not. So it's like kids develop these stories and they create these narratives around difficult things in life that becomes a part of the financial belief story. So if we don't go and examine that, and that hasn't been a part of this industry for a very long time, if we don't examine that, sometimes we don't know what the drivers of our financial decisions are, those silent drivers that are like underneath the surface. And so that is where I love financial psychology, because for an individual whose parent is one way and they are another, we start to walk down memory lane and we say, okay, let's start to think about the experiences that you've had as a child and how you reacted to them. And then what coping mechanisms you've put in place to deal with that. Because oftentimes we are running at like a mental efficiency standard. We don't stop and think about these things and try to break our routines and habits. We've created these routines and habits and we have to disrupt them to understand why we're doing it and then to help ourselves make better financial decisions.
I'm going to close the show with sort of an unpacking further of that last thread that you were just discussing here. So for the folks that are listening and the message is resonating and they're realizing that their emotions or fears are driving their financial decisions, what is something that they can do this afternoon, tomorrow morning, whatever, to start rewiring those behaviors?
This is an easy one for me. I say it all the time. Pay attention. Because it doesn't require you to enact a new behavior. It requires you to stop when you go and make a purchase, when you go and make a financial decision. Just start to pay attention to your patterns. Pay attention to the feeling comes up. If you're someone that likes to do a point of sale purchase when you're walking out of a store, why is that? Like, start to pay attention to the feelings when you are spending money. And also think back to your earliest money memory that you have that has an emotion tied to it. Because what I've noticed is that there's an exercise out there that I will do with clients, and it's a quick exercise, and we want to go and sort of understand all the financial flashpoints that are out there. But what it does is once you start thinking about that, it opens up the door, because you might not think of a ton of memories on the spot, but it will open up that door and memories will start to come to you. They will start to come to you. So if you stop and pay attention to the things that are happening in your financial life and you think about your earliest money memory and what emotions are tied to it, the puzzle pieces will start to appear.
Interesting stuff. Kate, I need you to tell the audience how they can find you, how they can connect with you, and learn more about you.
Sure. So you can go to bmt.com, which is brynmawrtrust.com. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. It's Kate Duffy. And they are my two main sites where you can find me right now.
Awesome. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today Behind the Numbers. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Dave, thank you so much. And thanks for sticking with me with the technical difficulties.
Always. Thanks for your persistence as well. And thank you out there for going behind the numbers with us today. If this episode sparked a new perspective, please take 10 seconds, leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcast. It is the best way to help the show grow. And make sure you're subscribed so that you're ready for the next one. Until next time, I'm Dave Bookbinder, reminding you that the numbers tell the story, but the people bring it to life. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.